I'm happy today to introduce Dr. Tatsuya Amano, who will be giving the seminar today. Tatsuya, as many of you will have met Tatsuya, he's a ARC Future Fellow in the School of Biological Sciences. I believe he started close to 2 years ago now, if I'm not mistaken. Tatsuya's had a tremendously productive research career thus far, as evident by this Future Fellowship. He did his graduate studies at the University of Tokyo, where he studied water bird ecology and conservation. From there, he moved on to Cambridge, where he spent, I think, close to 10 years continuing his work on migratory water birds. But this is also, I believe, where his research into language barriers in science and conservation blossomed. And that, of course, is culminated in what sounds like a very exciting project that he's going to talk to us about today. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Tatsuya. Thanks.
Great. Yep, thanks very much. So I will share my screen. Can you see it?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so hi everyone. So I hope you enjoyed some break during the festive season, or maybe still enjoying some break. And thanks very much for coming by talk today. So it is my great pleasure to kick off this year's seminar series with my talk about our project, which is called Translate Project. And you might have heard about this project before, but I haven't had a chance to in detail explain its whole picture. So today I'm hoping to briefly go over the objectives of the project, as well as the progress we have made so far. So the very first thing I want to clarify is the Translate project is not about translating scientific papers, but more generally about transcending language barriers to environmental sciences and more broadly, science in general. But language barriers are actually a very multifaceted problem. So what type of language barriers are we focusing on in particular? So in this paper published in 2016, we showed that up to 36% of the existing conservation literature appeared to be published in languages other than English. But such non-English language scientific knowledge is probably hugely underused in the global synthesis of scientific knowledge. So here is our first question in this project, which is how non-English language science is used in global knowledge synthesis. And if, as we expect, this is the case, so if non-English language scientific knowledge is hugely underused at the global level, this could be a huge loss to international communities because there might already be some important scientific knowledge available, but because those are published in studies, those are available in studies published in languages other than English, so it's not easily accessible to international communities. So our next big question is about what the consequences of ignoring non-English language sciences are. Then there's the other type of language barriers where scientific knowledge available in English language is not effectively used in local application of scientific knowledge, such as local decision-making in countries where English is not widely spoken. So our questions regarding this type of language barriers are how science available in different languages is used in local decision-making, and how language barriers might impede the uptake of English language science. So overall, our project aims to understand the consequences of language barriers to the use of scientific knowledge in conservation science, as well as in science in general. And we are also hoping to devise some solutions to increasing the use of non-English language scientific knowledge in global synthesis of knowledge, and increasing the use of English language scientific knowledge in local application of scientific knowledge. So this is basically the whole picture of our Translate project. So today, I'm going to talk about the progress we have made so far in answering these questions I just mentioned. And for today, I will focus on these 3 questions because these are where we have actually made some progress so far. So first, how is non-English language science used in global knowledge synthesis? In a collaboration with IPBS fellows, we looked at the proportion of references cited in these 8 IPBS assessments by language. And obviously, not surprisingly, English language references dominate in most assessments, with on average 96% of the references cited being in English. And this is in clear contrast to the result that I just mentioned, that about 36% of the about 36% of the existing conservation literature seems to be written in languages other than English. So clearly, this indicates that most of the existing non-English language literature is not being used in the global level knowledge synthesis. So we now know that, as expected, non-English language scientific knowledge is hugely underused at the global level. So if this is the case, what can be the consequences of this? That is the question we have been trying to answer. And I think that the current underuse of non-English language literature among scientific communities is probably based on the following 4 common assumptions. The first assumption is that most scientific knowledge today must be available in English because English is the common language of science. The second assumption is that as science has increasingly become globalized, more and more non-native English speakers are also publishing their work in English, so non-English language literature must be diminishing. Then, thirdly, even if a fair amount of non-English language scientific knowledge does exist, some people might assume that English language science effectively represents a random subset of all existing scientific knowledge across the globe. So non-English language scientific knowledge might safely be ignored. And finally, people might also assume that the quality of non-English language science is lower than that of English language science. But actually, all of these assumptions are mostly based on intuition, not necessarily backed up by actual evidence. So we have been trying to test these assumptions to understand the consequences of ignoring non-English language science. And the way we have been testing these is by conducting discipline-wide searches for studies that test the effectiveness of conservation interventions. As you might know, the Conservation Evidence Project, based at the University of Cambridge, has been identifying English language studies that test the effectiveness of conservation interventions based on a set of predefined selection criteria. So our project has been trying to apply the same selection criteria to identify non-English language scientific studies that test the effectiveness of conservation interventions. And as part of this, we aimed to compare the information that has been published in different languages, namely study locations, study species, and study designs, in order to understand the consequences of ignoring non-English language science. And thanks to the huge amount of work that has been done by over 40 native speakers of different languages over the past 3 years, we have identified 466 peer-reviewed journals in ecology and conservation in 19 languages, the list of which is available on our website. And of these, we screened over 400,000 papers in 330 journals in 16 languages. Then we identified 1,198 relevant non-English language studies that test the effectiveness of conservation interventions, providing important evidence for biodiversity conservation. And this is compared to some 6,000 English language studies that have already been stored at the Conservation Evidence Database. But actually, these numbers are not directly comparable because there are still many other English language studies that have already been identified by the Conservation Evidence Project, but have yet to be stored in the database. And also, obviously, the proportion of relevant studies in each journal varied greatly among languages, with Japanese showing the highest proportion, followed by Hungarian and French. But anyway, we can at least say that the first assumption that today most scientific knowledge is available in English is not supported by evidence, because we found that over 1,000 non-English language studies provide some important scientific evidence for biodiversity conservation. Then, as I said, we have already identified 466 journals in 19 languages, some of which have been publishing papers since the 19th century. So this result alone also indicates that a non-negligible amount of scientific knowledge is still being published in non-English languages too. Then the second assumption we are testing here is the notion that non-English language literature is diminishing. And here's a figure showing yearly changes in the number of relevant studies testing conservation interventions in 10 languages. And as you can see, in 4 languages, Japanese, German, Simplified Chinese, and Portuguese, the number of relevant studies has been increasing significantly. And the other 2 languages, French and traditional Chinese, also showed a nearly significant increase in the number of relevant studies over time. And the other 4 languages also did not show any significant decrease either. So this result showed that non-English language literature that provides important evidence for conservation is actually not diminishing, but rather increasing in many languages. Then Shawan from CBCS has also been doing this amazing work to investigate how the amount of conservation-related literature in different languages has been changing over the years. And here the result based on Google Scholar shown in green here, and domestic databases shown in pink. And as shown here, English language literature on biodiversity conservation has been increasing unsurprisingly. There's some recent decrease here, but this may be due to the time lag between publications and identifications by Google Scholar. And now, if we look at other languages, overall, the amount of literature on biodiversity conservation has been increasing in most languages, but especially in Portuguese, Spanish, Simplified Chinese, and Russian, and so on. And only French and German showed a decreasing trend when based on local literature databases. But patterns based on Google Scholar for these 2 languages are very different, as shown in green here. So I think we still need to double check result for these 2 languages. But anyway, this result again shows that the second assumption, non-English language literature is diminishing, is not necessarily supported by evidence, but rather non-English language literature is actually increasing. Then next, the third common assumption is that English language science represents a random subset of existing scientific knowledge. And there have already been multiple attempts to test this assumption, mainly in the research area of healthcare. For example, it has been shown that more statistically significant results are more likely to be published in English language journals because it's more influential. And this issue is already known as language bias in evidence synthesis. More specifically, language bias in statistical results, meaning that the nature and direction of a study's results can affect what language it is published in. However, we thought there might be slightly different type of language bias existing, especially in ecology and conservation, which is language bias in study characteristics. For example, studies conducted on local endemic species might be more likely to get published in non-English language journals because these studies are not necessarily of high interest to international readers. And then, but if such a language bias in study characteristics does exist, that's a serious issue because then by ignoring non-English language studies, we could miss a huge amount of important scientific evidence on very local species and ecosystems in countries where English is not widely spoken. So we have been comparing study characteristics, more specifically study locations and study species between the identified English and non-English language studies. And here, these blue grid cells show the distribution of English language studies stored in the conservation evidence database. And you can see that English language studies are, unsurprisingly, concentrated in some countries like the UK and the US. And this creates a huge gap in the availability of evidence that is useful for conservation in other parts of the world, such as in Latin America, Africa, Russia, and some Asian countries. And this is of particular concern because these regions are quite often most biodiverse. And then you can see that we found a number of non-English language studies reporting important evidence for conservation in those regions with little information when based on English language studies only. So this clearly indicates that there's a systematic bias in study locations between English and non-English language studies. And if we ignore these non-English language studies, we could lose scientific knowledge on species and ecosystems in these very biodiverse regions. Then here's a figure that compares the study species between English and non-English language studies. Now, these are a bit complicated figures, but here these blue bars show the number of English language studies available for each species. For example, the bird species with the highest number of English language studies was skylark, shown here on far left, with about 35 English language studies testing interventions for this particular species. And in contrast, for example, there are about 300 bird species around here with only one English language study available. And then these upside down orange bars show the number of non-English language studies per species for those species with both English and non-English language studies. For example, skylarks, shown on the far left here again, also has relatively many, about 15 non-English language studies. But what's most important here is these red bars showing the number of non-English language studies per species for those without any English language studies. So these include 361 bird, 68 mammal, and 18 amphibian species. So this result indicates that, again, there's a clear bias in study species between English and non-English language studies. And by ignoring non-English language studies, we could lose some important scientific evidence for a non-negligible amount of these bird, mammal, and amphibian species. Okay, so the final assumption we are testing is the idea that the quality of non-English language science is lower than that of English language science. And for this, we compared the study designs that have been adopted, as study designs reflect how rigorously each study is testing the effectiveness of conservation interventions. And as we can see here, studies in these 7 languages use less robust study designs, meaning that the quality of obtained evidence could be lower when compared to English language studies. And in contrast, somehow, Portuguese studies use more robust study designs than English language studies. And the other 3 languages, Hungarian, French, and Spanish, did not show a significant difference. So although results varied among languages, the quality of non-English language science does seem to be lower than that of English language science for many languages. So to sum up the results obtained so far, our research has shown that the first three common assumptions on non-English language literature are not supported by actual evidence. We showed that instead, a non-negligible number of non-English language studies provides evidence on the effectiveness of conservation interventions. The number of relevant non-English language studies is actually increasing in many languages. And there's a clear bias in study locations and species between languages, and non-English language studies could fill gaps in the geographic and taxonomic coverage of English language evidence. Then the fourth assumption about the quality of non-English language studies seems to be supported to some degree, but this is an overall pattern, and there's still high quality research in other languages too. And what's important is that we also need to consider the trade-off between evidence quality and availability. As we have just shown, for many species in countries where English is not widely spoken, the only evidence available might be in that particular local language. And in that case, using such lower quality evidence might be better than using no evidence at all, but we are actually still not sure. So this is something we still need to investigate further. But anyway, all in all, our findings so far indicates that non-English language studies, non-English language literature still plays a non-negligible role in conservation. And I believe that making a better use of such non-English language studies is key to synthesizing scientific knowledge accumulated across the globe and maximizing scientific contribution to global challenges like biodiversity conservation. And just last week, we published this correspondence article on the need for multilingual searches in global literature reviews. So if you're interested, please do have a look at this paper as well. Okay, so let me briefly touch on this other question of how science available in different languages is used in local decision making. For this, we have been developing another global collaboration to identify national level reports on biodiversity conservation that meet these specific criteria. And with this, we aim to investigate the number of English language references versus non-English language references cited in these national level reports. And our collaboration is still growing, now covering 32 countries across the globe. But our coverage in Southeast Asia, Western Asia, and Africa is still very low. So if you know anyone who might be interested in this collaboration, please do let us know. And for many countries, we have already identified these very influential, quite often governmental reports on the state of biodiversity in each country. And we haven't completed the data collection for all the countries yet, but when we looked at the proportion of references cited in some example reports by language, we were actually surprised at the very high proportion of non-English language references in most reports, shown in yellow and orange in this figure. So across these 12 reports where data collection has been completed, 71% of the references cited was on average in non-English languages. And as you might remember, this is in stark contrast to the IPBES assessment with only 3.4% of the references being in non-English languages. This result clearly indicates that non-English language literature is still recognized as a very important information source at the national level in many countries. However, there could be two explanations for this. First, it could be because non-English language references do contain important information for the report. But it may also be because language barriers have impeded access and the use of English language references for these reports. So to distinguish between these two possibilities, We are also conducting a questionnaire survey with the authors and editors of the selected reports. And we are still in the process of conducting this survey for most countries. But once done, we should be able to investigate the more detailed processes underlying this very high level of usage of non-English language literature in domestic conservation reports. Right, so that's it from me today. As I said, this diagram shows the major objectives of our Translate project, but we have also been more broadly working on other topics related to language barriers in conservation and in science in general. Recently, Pablo has done this amazing work on identifying where in the world bird species conservation especially confronts language barriers. And our webinar at eLife has led to the compilation of a list of 10 simple tips for overcoming language barriers in science. And we have also started another collaboration for quantifying the cost of being a non-native English speaker in academia. And as you can imagine, this is a very completely novel research field. And we still have so many other interesting, exciting ideas. So if you're interested, or if you know anyone who might be interested in collaborating, please do let us know. We will be happy to discuss any possibilities and develop any other exciting collaborations. Okay, so I think that's it. And thanks very much for listening today. And I'm now happy to answer any questions. Thank you.